I'm John Batchelor. This is the John Batchelor Show. Eastern Ukraine under attack by the National Guard forces of Western Ukraine, a civil war in Ukraine. At risk is not just the Black Sea Basin. At risk is comity in Europe. Moscow sending its foreign minister to Berlin within these next hours. Probably Mr. Lavrov is inbound to Berlin, or if not already there, along with France's foreign minister, Ukraine's foreign minister, to discuss the breakdown in the ceasefire and the reports of attacks launched against Luhansk and Donetsk, especially Donetsk Oblast, and the darkness in Sloviansk right now. Professor Steve Cohen is here, and he has a new piece up at The Nation. I urge you all to go to it right now. It's called The Silence of American Hawks, about Kiev's atrocities. Let's talk about those atrocities, because Steve listed them quickly to begin with. But the details raise the question again, where are the American voices in this? Steve, the Odessa fire, May 2nd. There is plenty of information, including videos, that was a deliberate effort to lynch people who were supporting or in some way defying Kiev. We have no investigation launched on it so far, but the evidence, the photographic evidence, points to not only the fire, but the people inside being kept there or fired at by people outside.
There's a political group in Ukraine called Right Sector. It is ideologically associated with the Svoboda Party, which is an ultra-nationalist party, and which is not only in the Ukrainian parliament today, but is part of the coalition government that the United States helped bring to power. So Svoboda is part of the ruling regime, and in the streets and in the army are a group of very tough guys, ultra-nationalists to the extent that many people call them neo-fascists, who have played a major role in events in Ukraine since February. They were throwing Molotov cocktails at the police. Some people think they were behind the sniper killings that brought down Yanukovych. But what happened is when Kiev decided to begin, and it's very important to understand what Kiev calls its military campaign. It calls its military campaign against the eastern cities, against its own citizens, an anti-terrorist operation, anti-terrorist. In other words, it's calling rebels or protesters or political oppositionists in eastern Ukraine terrorists. And you don't negotiate with terrorists, you kill them. And that's been the kind of ideology of the military operation. But what happened when Kiev sent its regular army to the east, a significant number of regular military units did not want to fight, refused to fight, or could not fight. And so Kiev hastily created what it now calls a National Guard, the basis of which were right sector fighters and other ultra-nationalist street fighters. And most of the reports testify that in the last 2.5 months or so, those National Guard forces have been responsible for a lot of the wanton attacks on apartment buildings and hospitals, and the killing of civilians generally. Now, flash briefly to Odessa on May 2. What we know for sure is Ukraine is full of political conflict, and a group of pro- and anti-Kiev protesters were in the streets, but this part was organized, and Right Sector showed up to enact it. The pro-Kiev protesters drove a smaller group of anti-Kiev protesters into a public building, sealed the exits, or tried to seal the exits, and threw Molotov cocktails, that's gasoline set on fire, into the buildings. The building slowly became an inferno. People tried to escape. Those who did escape were, many of them, murdered, beaten to death, shot to death, strangled even, some of the videos show, as they fled the building. Many others died in the flames. We don't know the number, at least 40, probably many more, and we've never been told how many were so seriously wounded that they died in hospitals. Now, you could say that was an exception. It looked like a pogrom, and it awakened in Kiev memories of Nazi extermination units traveling around the country during World War II. You could say it was an exception, except for a number of things. First, Kiev never denounced it. It applauded it. Secondly, Washington never called for an investigation, never issued any words of condolences. But mainly, it was prelude to this anti-terrorism military campaign that Kiev then launched in a whole series of eastern and southeastern cities, where there were also different kinds of massacres. Killings of people who had gathered in a park in Mariupol and Kramatorsk. So you're getting a kind of not only attack on cities, which inevitably produces civilian casualties, but you're getting a kind of wanton ideological assault on these cities. Now, the American apologists for Kiev say neo-fascism exists in Ukraine, but it's of no consequence. It's tiny. I say it's evident in these military campaigns, but it's also evident in the politics of Kiev, where Svoboda, whose presidential candidate got 1%, and right sector got 1%, 2% in the presidential elections, nonetheless were given 5 to 8 top ministry positions. They have enormous political influence in Kiev. In fact, right sector and Svoboda were against the ceasefire. They clamored and protested Poroshenko's ceasefire, and now they applaud the ceasing of the ceasefire.
Do I remember correctly that Svoboda was Tymoshenko's party?
No, that's incorrect. Hers was called, I think, the Fatherland Party, and that's Yatsenyuk, who's the prime minister. But another aspect of this, I mentioned in the article, is the mainstreaming of this very extremist, ultra-nationalist, call it fascist if you want, I don't know, but this ultra-nationalist perspective into the political mainstream of the government that we support.
Well, we learned in the 20th century, Steve, it takes less than 10% to flip a country to anarchy. We know that. You don't need popular numbers. You just need a dedicated group with guns. And
a collapse of the center. That's absolutely right. And we have, people always cite the two examples, rightly so. Lenin's Bolsheviks in Russia, who were a fringe, very fringe party on the eve of the 1917 revolution and came to power 10 months later, and of course Hitler's Nazis, who were a fringe group in Bavaria, and we know what happened then. So to say that these people only got 2% in a presidential election is a formal way of apologetic thinking that isn't analytical. The question is, how much ideological, political, and military power do these extreme elements have in Ukraine, in the regime that the White House is supporting?
And I'll mention, we come back, we're going to speak to the facts as we understand it now, what the threat is. The Prime Minister of Ukraine, Yatsenyuk, Steve mentioned him, Fatherland Party. In Steve's piece in The Nation, Yatsenyuk is quoted as calling the people of resistance in southeast Ukraine subhumans. We've heard that language before. It's associated with massacre. Subhumans. The man you see in the news has used that term towards half the country. Steve Cohen will be back. I'm John Batchelor.